is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories.
They're conveying very clearly now that now is the time to leave.
The warning to US citizens as pressure builds on Russia to de-escalate tension on the border with Ukraine.
Fear of war and fear of inflation. Political and economic uncertainty is rattling global markets, with Wall Street tumbling into the red.
The IMF is also spooking investors, warning that the global economy is in a weaker position than expected.
And drivers stranded overnight as freak snowstorms bring Athens and several parts of Greece to a standstill.
US President Joe Biden insists there is total unity with European leaders over any Russian aggression towards Ukraine.
NATO allies have warned of unprecedented sanctions against Russia, while the United States has put 8,500 troops on standby as part of wider NATO reinforcements.
This comes as France prepares to host talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials.
We'll be in Moscow in a moment with our correspondent Stuart Smith. But first, let's go to Paris and talk to Ryan Thompson. And Ryan, tell us a little bit more about the Ukraine crisis meeting. Is pressure mounting on Russia to defuse this crisis?
Well, when you look at who was on this call last night at the initiative of the U.S. President Joe Biden, it was quite a powerful group of heads of states and heads of government, everyone from Poland to Italy, NATO, Brussels, the European government, and of course these two powerhouses at the center of these Normandy talks, which have often been the tool to solve some of these crises, Germany and France. And the real message come out of that is that France, as they take on the European Council presidency, wants to make sure that Europe is at the table and that they are all involved in this dialogue, because we've seen a lot of negotiations and attempts to resolve this solution by the United States, of course, a huge diplomatic powerhouse alone. But Europe's message here is that there's so much at stake for them. There's a lot to lose, but a lot to gain as well through good diplomacy and a common mission. So Emmanuel Macron really wants to ensure here that these meetings between Russia and the United States also include the European voice and that they are at the table as well. He believes that the Normandy format should continue and remain to be the tool that is used to resolve these crisis disputes. He will actually head to Berlin tonight. He's on his way there now to discuss the situation at length with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and potentially see some common ground ahead of some very important meetings tomorrow, the resumption of these Normandy talks, where representatives from Ukraine and Russia will be here in Paris alongside their French and German counterparts. Unlike previous talks where there's been heads of state actually at the table, this time around it will be just high-level diplomatic advisors. And it does seem that this goal, this idea of really having Europe at the center of this crisis resolution, is agreed to even by partners within this NATO organization that aren't European. Of course, that does include the United States, but it also includes the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister there, Boris Johnson, speaking a little bit earlier, said that he was prepared to come to the support of Europe with very strong sanctions. Take a listen.
We have a hard-hitting package of sanctions ready to go. What I think would be fair to say is we want to see our European friends ready to deploy that package as soon as there should be any incursion at all by Russia into Ukraine.
Ryan, do you think this meeting in Paris between Russian and Ukrainian officials is going to break the stalemate?
Well, based on conversations with advisors within the French diplomatic service, it does seem to be that they think there is a will on the side of Russia to at least begin to really approach a conflict resolution here, something where there can be a little bit of give and take tomorrow. Now, what will actually come out of tomorrow's talks, we don't expect too much, at least at the high level, because, of course, it's not these heads of state that would be making big announcements or big resolutions, but these advisors will at least attempt to begin the groundwork towards a potential conflict conflict resolution that could come in a couple of days or weeks even. Emmanuel Macron's statement after last night's announcement that this would all happen is that he plans to meet with both of these leaders separately in a very short amount of time. So we are keeping our eyes peeled here from Paris as this develops over the next few days.
Ryan Thompson, thank you for the update.
Well, let's bring in Stuart Smith now, who's in Moscow for us. So, Stuart, what's the latest from the region?
Well, in terms of Russian military activity, which is the thing that Western nations are keeping a keen eye on, there are another set of drills on top of drills already taking place on top of drills, this time in Crimea, which is a territory Ukraine still under international law owns, but is de facto Russian territory. It's managed by Russia. So drills there are sending a very strong message to Ukraine that Russia is right on Ukraine's doorstep, and it's certainly going to do nothing to calm nerves in Ukraine. There are around 6,000 troops there undertaking live fire drills, as well as ships in the Black Sea, which surrounds Crimea. Ukraine. To the east, we still have this large contingent of around 100,000 Russian troops. That's the estimate from Ukraine. And with the drills, joint drills announced just a few weeks ago with Belarus, there are now Russian troops north of Ukraine on the Belarusian border. So it's all of this military activity which is causing concern. Ukraine, though, notably not quite as concerned as either the United Kingdom or the United States in terms of how likely an escalation is to happen in, for example, the next few weeks. The United States and UK having evacuated some of its embassy staff and encouraging families to leave. Ukraine says that's premature, and that intelligence doesn't justify that at the moment. Ukrainian intelligence saying at the moment there are not enough troops to, for example, mount a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is, throughout all of this, something Russia, we should add, is keen to say it has no intention of doing. Talking of sanctions, which is the preferred policy of most Western European nations in preventing an incursion into Ukraine, we heard today from the United States an unnamed senior diplomat talking about trying to allay the fears of countries like Austria and Germany, which rely heavily on Russian gas and would potentially be a roadblock for any kind of sanctions on the gas sector, notably potentially Nord Stream 2. So America looking at finding ways to deliver gas or energy to Europe should sanctions need to be put in place. But we heard again from Russia today, reminding the world that should sanctions be placed on Russia, Russia would return sanctions in kind. And so this is not something that would just affect Russia. If sanctions are imposed, this would have a big effect on the European Union and the United States as well. Having said that, the Russian economy is already suffering from even just the threats or the talk of war. The Russian ruble down to 14-month low against the United States dollar, and shares plummeting as well.
So, Stuart, amid all this, do you get the sense that Russia is actually ready to defuse this crisis?
Well, if you take a look at the newspapers, there is still a lot of uncertainty. Often it can be a guide, reading Russian newspapers, Russian state television, as to what the current thinking is of the administration. But there is still uncertainty amongst the papers. There seems to be little appetite for war. But if you understand the framing, it's not framed as Russia going into Ukraine to start a war. The perspective from Russia and the Kremlin and the authorities is that if anything should happen, it would be due to Ukraine or the West taking perhaps action under the pretext of defensive measures, and therefore Russia would be forced to respond, forced into a war. But it's not a call for war here in Russia.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, many thanks. Shares in Credit Suisse fell more than 2% in Zurich after the investment bank warned of a loss in the fourth quarter. Credit Suisse has faced a series of scandals in recent years. Its chairman resigned this month for flouting coronavirus quarantine rules, while its former CEO resigned in 2020 over a spying scandal. Unilever is cutting around 1,500 management jobs worldwide. The company wants to reshape its business to focus on 5 key product areas. It comes after the rejection of a bid to buy GlaxoSmithKline's consumer arm. The UK government borrowed less money than expected last year. It racked up nearly $200 billion of debt, around $17 billion below forecasts. Analysts say the government could now delay a tax rise that's due in April, but there are still challenges. The government paid a record $10 billion to service its debt in December due to rising inflation.
Guess what? The global economy has started off 2022 in a weaker position than anticipated. In its updated World Economic Outlook, the International Monetary Fund says the pandemic's persistence, higher inflation and supply chain issues have disrupted recovery and continue to weigh on activity from the United States to China to many emerging market economies. Global growth is expected to moderate from 5.9% in 2021 down to 4.4% in 2022, and it's going to slow to 3.8% in 2023. And that's largely reflecting forecast markdowns in the two largest economies. The United States, that's down 1.2%. Supply chain disruptions key there. And China has been downgraded 0.8%. Zero tolerance COVID-19 policy and financial stress in the property sector weighing on recovery. And by the way, that 2023 forecast we just saw before, that's a little higher than previous forecasts based on vaccination rates and therapies improving around the world. Now, the risks, no big surprises here, are COVID-19 uncertainty, supply bottlenecks, and more uncertainty around inflation and policy paths. The IMF's chief economist is urging policymakers across the globe to focus on ending the pandemic.
First and foremost, we need to end the grip of this pandemic. That requires much stronger global cooperation and action to make sure that there is widespread vaccination, testing, and access to therapeutics, including the new antiviral drugs that are on the market, and it should be made available equitably around the world. Secondly, for individual countries, their national policies should be tailored to country-specific circumstances, depending upon the pace of their recovery, inflation dynamics, and the amount of fiscal and monetary policy space they have. The global economy remains in the grip of the pandemic. New virus variants could further disrupt the recovery. We're seeing inflation come up strongly in many countries. If, for instance, that leads to much more tighter monetary policy in the US than that's being expected, then that could tighten global financial conditions. In China, if there are more lockdowns because of the zero COVID strategy, then that could lead to more global supply chain disruptions. So these are some of the risks that we are concerned about.
Let's talk to Melha Nabbar, who's the head of the IMF research team, which produces the World Economic Outlook. And thanks for joining us today on Global Business Europe. Look, inflation, ballooning global debt, COVID hasn't gone away. Have we hit the bottom?
Well, we are projecting this moderation in global growth. We've cut our forecast by 0.5 percentage point. We think that that's a sign here of the downgrades in the US and China. We do expect the Omicron variant to have a negative impact in the first quarter, but for the effects to fade fairly rapidly after that going forward. But there's huge uncertainty around that, depending on how things evolve with this variant. And more importantly, the concern about the possibility that deadlier variants emerge going forward. And I think that's the clip that we just heard from Geeta Gopinath referring to the importance of vaccinations and health policies as being the critical thing that we need to get right going forward. That remains our primary policy focus for ensuring that all countries get back on paths of durable recovery going forward.
Where would you say the main pressure points are? Are we looking at manufacturing? Are we looking at real estate? Or does it depend where you are, Europe, the United States, China?
Well, the number one overarching challenge that all economies face really is to get ahead of this pandemic. Even in countries which have very high vaccination rates, there's no guarantee that infections will remain under control. And we've seen this with Delta, we've seen this with Omicron. But beyond this cross-cutting challenge, there are specific country issues that countries are grappling with. The supply disruptions have persisted longer than we'd anticipated, and that's hurting economies that have large manufacturing sectors like the United States, like Germany. The rising prices that have accompanied this have further fueled a broadening of price pressures, which were already elevated to begin with because of high commodity prices, high fuel prices, high food prices. We've seen it in many emerging market and developing economies facing elevated inflation over the course of the last year. And that's another pressure point that many economies are confronting, which is prompting a shift in monetary policy stances by central banks across the world, including here in the United States with the Federal Reserve.
And that's one of the reasons, I suppose, that you are recommending urgent policy actions to ensure an equitable recovery. But the IMF have also said repeatedly that investing in climate policies is imperative. Do you fear that that is slipping down the agenda?
Well, it's important to keep that in focus as well. While we grapple with this health emergency, the climate emergency continues to unfold. The frequency and intensity of climate change-related natural disasters has risen, and it's affecting all economies, including economies that are vital points in global supply chains, with floods and events of that sort leading to factory closures. It's affecting countries that are least able to deal with this problem, coastal regions where we've seen rising water levels affecting activity in coastal regions, creating huge humanitarian costs and economic costs for all the countries that are affected. And it's important to get ahead of this. And we've been saying for a while now that this requires a multi-pronged approach with ramping up investments in green infrastructure, with subsidies for research into renewable technologies, storage technologies, and with a carbon pricing element to shift the demand away from fossil fuels, and to use the revenues that are generated through those carbon pricing mechanisms to compensate those that are worst affected by the energy transition. So with a multi-pronged approach of that kind at the national level, we do see that that's an important aspect of getting ahead of this problem of rising global temperatures and minimizing the risks of catastrophic economic and health outcomes going forward.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're chiming in with your boss, the head of the IMF, saying that we need to be data-driven and need to be flexible. So, in a nutshell, which economies do you think are getting it right, and who really needs a wake-up call?
Well, we have seen over the past 2 years a divergence in prospects because of differences in policy support based on the amount of policy space that countries had going into this crisis. We've seen divergences in prospects because of differences in vaccination rates. Those that have been successful in vaccinating quickly have been able to resume activity a lot faster. And these two forces are really shaping the divergent prospects going forward. All countries were hit with a common shock, this common health shock. And the pace at which they're emerging out of this depends very much on country circumstances. And that's why in order to get all countries back on paths of durable recovery, there has to be a very strong international cooperation aspect to it on vaccines, on ensuring financially constrained economies have access to international liquidity, and going back to what we were just discussing, ensuring that we do get ahead of this climate emergency, where again there'll be a large role to be played by multilateral initiatives, including climate finance initiatives.
Multi-pronged or not, it is a very ambitious goal. Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much, Malha Nabar, head of the IMF research team.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, Wall Street wipeout. Stocks tumble into the red as investors worry about war in Europe.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Beijing, China's capital and its cultural nerve center. A modern metropolis with traditional roots. And now it becomes the first city in the world to host both Summer and Winter Olympics. After 14 years, the biggest sporting extravaganza returns to Beijing. Thousands of athletes from around the globe will compete in over 100 events at 3 zones. Cheered on by over 1.4 billion Chinese citizens and millions abroad. CGTN will bring you a ringside view of the historic event. 2022 Beijing Olympics, the games that matter on CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. It's turning into another bruising session over on Wall Street as investors worry about rising inflation and the risk of war in Ukraine.
Last year, major indices hit high after record high, but this year the story is one of wild swings and major sell-offs. Well, let's get latest moves with John Terrett in New York. So, John, stocks in the red after a dramatic day of trading on Monday. What's the latest today?
Yes. Well, you know, Juliet and Robin, I don't know. I don't think many people do know. Let me tell you the story of yesterday, because we do know what happened on Monday. After we came off the air together yesterday, the Dow Jones fell down to 1,115 points, about 4%, something like that. And then in the late afternoon, I was standing there down there on the floor in the afternoon, and we watched the stock come storming back. It was unbelievable. And the Dow finally closed up 99 points, which was a gain of 1/3 of 1%. There was a swing in the course of the day, what they call the intraday swing, of 1,200 points. Now, I can't remember seeing anything quite like that in my almost 20 years in New York. The other markets came back as well. So what happened? Well, Bloomberg and JP Morgan Chase told us after the dust had settled yesterday, it looks as if retail investors, you know, these people in their basements trading away, it looks as if they panicked a bit more than was absolutely necessary given everything that's going on Monday. And I assume that the pros, I'm putting this in the very simplest of terms, I assume what happened was the professionals saw this, swept in and bargain hunted. It began in technology, but it spread to the other markets as well. And they got some pretty good bargains. Now, what's happening today is that the market started very, very much in the red, but it appears to be happening again. The situation is we've still got plenty of war talk in America. You know that. Particularly here in America, I would say. There's an awful lot of war talk going on. But we do have a very strong economy. 80% of the S&P 500 companies reporting their earnings have beaten Wall Street expectations, but just not in a stellar kind of way. There's been no sort of, oh, my goodness me, look what that company's done. You know, they've just beaten, and it's been a beat, but it hasn't been amazing. And then, of course, we wonder whether this will spread to Main Street, whether it'll spread to business. And the other big thing today, Tuesday now, the beginning of the 2-day Federal Reserve meeting to discuss interest rates and to try and deal with inflation, which is at a 40-year high. So here we go. The Dow started basically down 700 or 800 points earlier on today, but it's happening again. It's now down 390 points, roughly half what it was, 1%. S&P 500 and the Nasdaq are down as well, 2.7% to 2.3%, but, you know, less than they were earlier on. Financials, technology, retailers, no real serious gains that I can see, except in the energy sector, which is leading the 11 sectors of the S&P 500 at the moment. It's the only one in the green. So what happens come 4 o'clock this afternoon, which is in just under sort of 5 hours' time? Who knows, basically. Anyone's guess.
So, John, as you put it, plenty of war talk going on affecting the markets. Western allies are talking about unprecedented sanctions on Russia if they invade Ukraine. What might that actually entail?
Well, the range of possibilities from all countries in the world, but particularly this one, is absolutely astonishing. I mean, it's almost never ending. And I've just picked out a handful of you for you today. For example, they could restrict Russian exports. Now, we know that this works because it's been done before. In the era of the Cold War, which was basically the 1950s to the 1980s, in the days of the old Soviet Union, they crimped Russian exports, particularly technology. And that basically kept the old Soviet economy as a backward economy until Gorbachev came along and tore down the wall. So crimping of Russian exports is most definitely an effective tool. You could also restrict Russia converting rubles into dollars. You could also go after the sovereign wealth fund of Russia, which is called the Russian Direct Investment Fund. There are banking restrictions, of course, which they could put into place, including sanctioning banking transitions and freezing assets. And the big one, of course, you could eliminate Russia from the global financial messaging system called SWIFT. Now, if you've ever sent any money in the form of remittance home to another country, you know what the SWIFT is, because you have to have a number for your bank and you have to have a SWIFT number. And it's a sort of global system. There are something like 11,000 financial institutions enrolled in this in 200 countries. And you could take Russia out of that, which would really hobble things, except that I have to tell you, TASS, the Russian news agency, has just said within the last 2 hours, they've just said, well, if you take us out of SWIFT, then we can't send you any gas and oil to Europe, can we? Aha, see, you hadn't thought of that one, had you? Is what TASS is basically saying. On top of that, there are sanctions against people and travel restrictions. Some of this is already in place, but it could be expanded, including to President Putin, though it's likely that that would actually, mean total severance of all diplomatic ties between Moscow and Washington, D.C. And here's my final thought on this. You have to remember something. The U.S. economy is a $21 trillion economy, just under that, $21 trillion. The Russian economy is a $1.5 trillion economy. Just think about that. It is a fraction of the size of the United States economy. So anything that I've just described, and plus many more options, could absolutely cripple the Russian economy in a way from which it would be very difficult to recover. And I do think, amid all this war talk, it's worth bearing that in mind. Robin and Juliet?
Plenty to think about indeed. John Tarrant, thanks very much indeed.
7 migrants have died while trying to reach Italy's Lampedusa island. They were on a boat carrying almost 300 people that was intercepted by the Italian Coast Guard. Hermione Kitson reports.
Details have emerged of another ill-fated journey to Italy. Local authorities spotted the boat when it was about 50 kilometres off the coast of Lampedusa, south of Sicily, overnight. They found 3 bodies on board. Another 4 people died before the vessel reached port. It's believed the victims all died of hypothermia. Lampedusa Mayor Salvatore Martello confirmed the death toll and said the vessel was carrying 280 migrants, mainly from Bangladesh and Egypt. The prosecutor's office of Agrigento has opened an investigation into the deaths, and if any of the migrants rescued are identified as commanders of the boat, they could face charges. Lampedusa is known as the Door of Europe, as it's Italy's southernmost point and a frequent landing site for migrants seeking refuge from Libya or Tunisia. In recent months, there has been a worrying increase in the number of boats making the treacherous journey. Government figures show more than 1,700 migrants have disembarked in Italy's ports so far this year. Mayor Martello says the latest tragedy is unacceptable and that his tiny island has been forgotten by the Italian government and EU authorities. He's calling for urgent help both from Italy and internationally. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Rome.
An Australian Navy vessel carrying aid to Tonga has reported 23 cases of coronavirus. The ship is bringing emergency supplies after the volcanic eruption and tsunami. Australia's Defence Minister says the government is working with Tongan officials to decide on the next steps. Tonga is considered virus-free.
The Chinese ambassador to Tonga told CGTN there could be a severe shortage of food in the future if the situation doesn't improve.
The volcanic ashes have a very destructive effect on the agriculture. A lot of livestock died in the tsunami. The Prime Minister told me the other day that there might be a food crisis in a couple of months if the situation is not turning better. Right now, there are very few vegetables in the market, but the food is relatively stable in the market.
Still to come on CGTN. UK police say they will investigate lockdown parties in Downing Street following fresh claims of a birthday gathering for the Prime Minister.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and me, Juliet Mann. The headlines again. The West says it's united on a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine as the US readies troops for Eastern Europe.
The International Monetary Fund cuts its latest outlook with a warning that the global economy is weaker than expected.
And political and economic uncertainty rattles global markets as Wall Street tumbles into the red.
Well, let's go back now to our top story. The rising tension over Ukraine, which has seen NATO allies issue fresh warnings to Russia, with military forces on all sides being readied for action. Well, Jamie Shea is a former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges, and I'm pleased to say he joins us now on the programme. Great to have you back on the show with us. So there have been declarations of unity from the United States and Europe over possible Russian action in Ukraine. But in reality, different countries have very different ideas about how far they would commit to any action against Russia, don't they?
Well, I think that NATO has done a good job of staying united on the crisis. I've been at NATO in the past on many occasions when the alliance was far less united than it is today. United in the strong warning to Russia not to invade Ukraine, united in being ready to impose stiffer economic penalties on Russia if nonetheless it goes ahead and does invade Ukraine for the third time, it has to be said, since 2014. United in being prepared to reinforce the NATO member states in Central and Eastern Europe, who obviously are very nervous about a possible spillover of a conflict in Ukraine onto NATO territory. And finally, united in being willing and ready to negotiate with Russia, like NATO held a meeting with Russia in Brussels last week, to give Russia what we call an off-ramp, a chance to climb down, a chance to de-escalate, particularly by talking about arms control and military stability in Europe, if the Russians are prepared to take it. So yes, of course, you're going to have some nuances over this or that, but I think in the main, it's clear that in those four critical areas, NATO is standing together.
You say nuances. I wanted to ask you about Germany in particular. It has a new leader, perhaps unwilling to send troops. How much of a factor is Russia's gas supplies in all this?
Well, yes. I mean, clearly the Russians are very much hoping that they can use gas as a lever, particularly against Germany, because the European Union does import 40% of its gas from Russia. But that said, number one, the EU is trying to lessen that dependency by going to other players, particularly Norway at the moment, Algeria, Nigeria, the United States for liquefied natural gas to be able to diversify its supplies, which will therefore make that Russian sort of instrument less potent. Secondly, I think the Germans have stood up in the sense that they are willing to freeze the operation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline recently completed if Russia invades Ukraine, and that would make Russia pay a particularly high penalty. I mean, Europe may need to buy Russian gas, but Russia needs to sell that gas. So that sort of pressure works both ways. The final thing is, fortunately, the winter so far in Europe remains comparatively mild, so far at least, which means that the volumes of gas in storage will be adequate to cover Europe's needs. So my own sense is that although Russia may sort of brandish the gas weapon, it's not something in this crisis which is really going to exercise a decisive role.
And further talk today of more severe economic sanctions, heavier than anything seen before. That's how the British Prime Minister described them. What do you think those will look like? We heard that perhaps there would be restrictions on exports from our correspondent. What do you think restrictive sanctions might involve?
Well, this is a complicated business because they have to cover various areas. We've spoken about Nord Stream 2, where the German government is showing solidarity on that front, at least, with the allies. There's also been talk, for example, about excluding Russia from the SWIFT banking clearance system, which would make it impossible for Russia to receive payments for its trade or for its energy and so on. That would probably hurt quite a lot. There's talk about freezing Russian sovereign debt out of international markets. There's also talk about targeting certain technologies, particularly consumer electronics, those kind of things, which obviously would hurt Russian consumers. But these sanctions are always complicated because, of course, Russia has anticipated in advance that it could face those sanctions in the future. So, for example, in terms of banking clearance, it's been trying to see if it can come up with alternative arrangements. And clearly, as always with sanctions, the West or anybody imposing sanctions want to look at things that really do punish an aggressor while doing minimum damage to one's own economy. And, of course, those kind of trade-offs are not always easy. And I think that's the reason why there's been a lot of work in recent weeks between the United States and the European Union to try to come up with a package that meets those criteria, really inflicting pain on Russia as a deterrent to aggression, while at the same time being the sort of things that are going to do least harm to NATO's own economies. And that's a fine balance that somehow has to be struck if those sanctions are going to be effective, because they've got to hurt, but they've got to be the kind of things that at the end of the day, the US and the EU will really implement.
Jamie Shea, great to get your thoughts today. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you, as always.
British police have begun an investigation into parties held in government offices during COVID-19 lockdowns. It follows the latest revelation that a birthday party for Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2020 was attended by up to 30 people, and at the time, most indoor gatherings were restricted to just 2. Well, let's speak to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Good to see you, Andrew. Look, we've been hearing from Boris Johnson on the situation in Ukraine. And some might question if the timing of that statement is maybe a deflection tactic from what's going on his own front door.
Well, I think to be fair to Downing Street, they woke up with 2 problems on their mind. One was the situation in Ukraine, which is one shared as an issue by all European leaders and the American president as well. And the other were revelations in the papers of yet another gathering that had been made public, this time a birthday party for Boris Johnson held in June 2020, in which it suggested that 30 people gathered and a cake was presented. And Happy Birthday was sung, and then the party was broke up after that, and there were various ministers out this morning defending, again, the likelihood of that happening and the seriousness of it. And then this announcement by the police. Now, this is a real U-turn, because thus far the Metropolitan Police have said that they're not interested in investigating Downing Street, that they'll keep an eye on the civil service investigation, but otherwise it's not in their interest to go after ancient allegations of breaking lockdown rules. However, and also there have been criticisms about that decision, and also that about what's to be heard from the police that guard Downing Street every day. Didn't they have a story to tell? So the Metropolitan Police up until today had distanced themselves from this investigation. Well, today came that U-turn, and this decision means that something in the civil service inquiry has suggested to the police that there may indeed have been evidence of legal wrongdoing, and that there may indeed have been people who willfully did that or should have known that they shouldn't have done that, and that there's no reasonable excuse for that behaviour. So now this investigation goes ahead. The Prime Minister was informed of this before a cabinet meeting held this morning, but chose not to discuss it with his cabinet colleagues when that meeting took place. The rest of them found out when they saw this press conference.
As a result, firstly, of the information provided by the Cabinet Office inquiry team, and secondly, my officer's own assessment, I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years in relation to potential breaches of COVID-19 regulations.
Andrew, what does this mean for the Sue Gray report? Because that's into rule breaking, and we were expecting to have that published this week. Does this development put that on standby?
Well, when Cressida Dick gave that press conference, it seemed to throw all the cards into the air. There was an implication and an assumption, it has to be said, that if the Metropolitan Police were now investigating the same events that took place in Whitehall and Downing Street, then the civil service would have to wait until that investigation before they could publish theirs. And so the assumption earlier on today was that this could go on and drag on for weeks or even months. Now, interestingly, in the House of Commons, when the Prime Minister appeared to discuss the situation in Ukraine, he did give a brief statement about the police inquiry, and also welcomed the police inquiry, saying that it would draw a line under things for the public and add clarity. Now, the line from Downing Street is that they welcome both these investigations, that of Sue Gray, the civil servant, and of the Metropolitan Police. But it was assumed that the police would take precedence over the civil service investigation. Now, that appears perhaps not to be the case. It's not clear yet, but there are clearly conversations going on in the background to make decisions around releasing the pressure that this situation has created. And some of that may mean releasing some, or perhaps all, but probably some of the Sue Gray report in time, in other words, with the usual schedule, which is probably by the end of this week, perhaps holding some back until the police have reported, but not necessarily holding the whole thing back until the police have finished their investigation. It's still a ball in play, I think, and there are clearly discussions going on about the advisability of it, but everyone is aware that the longer no conclusions are reached about this business of these allegations of gatherings and parties in Downing Street and other Whitehall buildings, it creates a very bad atmosphere over Westminster and a lot of confusion as far as the public as well as the political machines are concerned. So there clearly is an eagerness to get things sorted out, so there may be some opportunity for the civil service to publish at least part of the report a little earlier than expected.
So watch this space, perhaps. Andrew Wilson, thank you very much.
The leaders of 5 Central Asian nations have hailed achievements made during 30 years of diplomatic ties with China. Chinese President Xi Jinping chaired a virtual meeting with the leaders of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. They agreed to enhance high-level exchanges and strengthen cooperation on security, pandemic control and China's Belt and Road Initiative.
The unique point about the Belt and Road Initiative is it doesn't go against the interests of most countries. On the contrary, it's consistent with the policies pursued by many. I can say that here in the Kyrgyz Republic, the Belt and Road Initiative is in line with our country's development strategy leading up to 2040. The importance of these infrastructure channels is they not only ensure import and exports with China, but that they also help to develop local infrastructure and economies along the way.
In Greece, schools, offices and most businesses are closed as authorities scramble to get a grip on the chaos caused by snowstorm Elpis.
The blizzard caused blackouts and closed roads in the Greek capital. Evangelos Ipsas reports from Athens.
A freak blizzard has forced Greece to declare a public holiday on Tuesday and Wednesday, closing down schools and many public services. Snowstorm Elpis has created chaos in the Greek capital of Athens, grounding many flights and making roads impassable. The authorities have apologized to the public, saying that they're doing everything they can to assist those who are in need.
Dear fellow citizens, all state and local authority forces will be fully deployed during the night and will intervene wherever it is needed. We urge citizens to avoid any movement. It's a difficult night. We must continue our effort together.
Waking up on Tuesday, Athenians saw their city covered in a thick blanket of snow. From above, the view was beautiful and breathtaking, but on the streets, it was a different story. Many neighborhoods are without electricity, and the transport system has been brought to a standstill. Trains and buses are suspended, and highways have been shut down, forcing motorists to abandon their vehicles, trudging home through heavy snow. The army was brought in after thousands of motorists became trapped in the Attikiodos highway overnight, giving out food and drinks and taking those worst affected to shelter. The Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis has demanded to know why so many people were stranded on a privately run stretch of road, saying that the company should compensate motorists close to $2,200. Meanwhile, meteorologists are forecasting low temperatures for Tuesday close to -4, and on Wednesday morning with the wind chill making it feel even colder, close to -11. Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN, Athens.
Coming up next, extraterrestrial security. The big players in Europe's space sector want the continent to up its game.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Fence here. Bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul. They brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
the front clear
line.
View of this front line position.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Some of the biggest players in Europe's space sector are in Brussels for the European Space Conference.
Many want Europe to make greater efforts to compete as a global space power, as more countries see it as an area of strategic and military importance. Laura Makin-Isherwood reports.
From satellite communications to climate monitoring, even strategic strength. When it comes to international security and defence, space is becoming an increasingly competitive domain. In Brussels, officials at the European Space Conference had a clear message to send.
Europe must defend its interest and freedom to operate in space. It has the necessary expertise, industrial capacity, of course, startups, assets to wait on the global stage.
That freedom includes the ability to launch and operate new equipment safely. With tens of thousands of pieces of space debris orbiting the Earth, the risk of collisions is growing. The China National Space Administration reported one of its satellites was almost hit by debris resulting from a Russian anti-satellite test carried out last year, and European nations are pushing for stricter regulation.
The Russian-guided anti-satellite test conducted in the low Earth orbit zone on 15 November last year, which was strongly condemned by the international community, illustrate the great need for a rule-based order in outer space as well.
Work is already underway in Brussels to try to bring nations into line. With mobile phones, transport systems, even banking, all reliant on available satellites, an EU policy is being formulated to try to protect those vital assets orbiting the Earth. And post-COVID, the space industry could have a role to play in Europe's recovery. The sector is believed to be worth around $65 billion to the European economy, a figure expected to grow over the next decade. But enabling the private sector to thrive and keep up with developments in this fast-moving sphere will require financial support from European banks.
To really make Europe a leading continent for innovative space solutions, for a better planet and improving our lives here on Earth, we need a persistent and substantial investment policy.
Part of a push by Europe to maintain its relevance beyond the continent. Laura Macon-Isherwood, CGTN, Brussels.
Well, Joseph Aschbacher is the director of the European Space Agency, and he told my colleague Ben Clark that there are many new exciting projects to look forward to.
2022 will be a busy year for us. We have actually a lot of milestones coming up. Some of them are launches of missions. We have ExoMars to be launched in September together with our Russian partners. Artemis, of course, comes before that. Artemis will be the first mission to the moon with NASA, where Europe has an essential contribution, the so-called ESM, the European Service Module, which means that without that, the moon mission would not be possible. So we are really we are on the critical path or an essential partner for these missions.
What is the potential role of space technology in addressing environmental, economic and security challenges?
There's a lot. Space is, first of all, on the environmental part, it is essential to understand our planet. Without space, you would not know how our climate and our planet changes. All the measurements of carbon dioxide, of deforestation, of fires on our planet, of the melting of the ice caps. All this can only be done because we have accurate satellites providing this information on a daily basis. This is essential. But also our astronauts, they have a unique view from the space station, and they tell us how fragile our planet is, how beautiful, but also how fragile. So there's a lot on this part, which is really where space is working on sustainability and the conservation of our planet.
What opportunities are there for collaboration in space? You did mention your work with your Russian partners. What other collaboration is underway beyond the European continent, perhaps?
No, of course, first we are used to work with international partners. Within Europe already we have 22 countries making up the European Space Agency. So you can believe me, this is a lot of intergovernmental cooperation within Europe. As you know, Canada is a cooperating state of ESA. And then we have, of course, agreements. We have hundreds actually, of agreements with different space agencies and partners worldwide. And they really go everywhere. This is going, of course, from the US on many aspects, but also all the way to China. We have agreements with China on the SMILE mission, on Dragon, which is a science program where we use Earth observation data to derive information of all kinds, from agriculture to forestry to some economic activities, with hundreds of scientists on the side, on the Chinese side and the European side, working very closely together on the use of space data. So yes, we work with many partners, and it's probably fair to say that the European Space Agency is the space agency having most international cooperation agreements with almost everyone.
How would you describe the role of the space and aerospace industry as the world recovers from what's been a pretty dreadful pandemic on a global scale?
Actually, this is quite surprising that despite COVID and some economic hardship in other segments, the space sector has been doing very well. We have increases in space budgets, both in public and in the private sector, in the double-digit domain, and this is really good. And the ESA budget, for example, this year is 12% larger than last year. But also in the private sector, we see increases of 167%, for example, in private money that has gone into space in Europe. And so, yes, the space sector is pretty resilient because on one side, we are dependent on space despite COVID and despite all the other elements. On the other side, it's a new economic opportunity, and companies and governments are investing because it's it's a domain of the future.
A rapid response medical team will be on standby throughout the Winter Games in Beijing.
More than 70 staff will be ready to provide emergency medical care for athletes. Sun Tianyuan reports.
When you were speeding downhill at up to 150 kilometers per hour, any mishap could be devastating. But alpine skiers at this year's Winter Olympics are in good hands. Meet the crew, China's emergency medical team for the Beijing Games, also known as Doctors on Skis. Bai Peng is one of them.
I'm a huge aficionado of the sport. I've been skiing for 12 years and I always feel free like the wind, gliding on the snow under the blue sky. I simply can't resist the feeling of being able to go anywhere I want.
In 2018, when China was recruiting the team, Bai thought, hey, why not make full use of his hobby?
So I took the test and passed it. I'm glad that I could apply my professional skills with my hobby.
Bai's regular job at Peking University Third Hospital doesn't require carrying a 15-kilogram med kit all the time. But on the snow, the doctor literally brings the entire emergency room to the patient.
Here are some bandages that we could use to stop the bleeding. Some appliances may not be used in 1 in 100 scenarios, but it could be the one the patient's life depends on. So we have to prepare for all kinds of situations.
Be it an ankle sprain or a coma, the doctors must arrive at the scene within 4 minutes using a technique called side-slipping.
Normally, that helps you move slowly down the slope horizontally, but it's still too fast on challenging slopes and an icy snow surface. We had several incidents and injuries over the past 3 years of training.
Aside from defying gravity and challenging terrain, the staff also have to deal with the extreme cold in the mountains.
You can't feel your fingers in just 30 seconds, so you must make a quick assessment of the condition and begin treating the injured, then clear the site and get out of there.
Their team, built from scratch, is a newcomer in the field of snow sports professional medical care, but they're ready with the art of healing.
The headlines again. The West says it's united on a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine as the US readies troops for Eastern Europe. NATO allies have warned of unprecedented sanctions against Russia, while the United States has put 8,500 troops on standby as part of wider NATO reinforcements.
More wild swings on Wall Street as political and economic uncertainty rattles global markets.
And the International Monetary Fund cuts its latest outlook, warning that the global economy is weaker than expected.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.